Dogman versus Werewolf Round 2. Dear Scary Stories NYC, there is something going on in the Midwest that you aren't gonna see reported on any kind of news program from left to right to independent. I am not the only person I know who, in the past 2 years, has been forced to live through savage battles on or near their property between what we feel must be dogmen versus what we now know must be werewolves. I don't personally blame any news outlet that would prefer to avoid this kind of a story. You can't really tell people for a fact that werewolves and dogmen even exist unless you have some of these creatures on hand, whether alive or not. You'd need DNA evidence. You need to explain what these animals or people even are, how they came to be, both historically and genetically. The public would need all that information before it would be convinced of the reality of this subject. But for single individuals to become convinced, you just sorta need to live through an experience. I classify both the dogmen and the werewolves as nighttime creatures. You'd better fear them at night, and you'd better doubt their existence during the day. If you talk about them too much under the sunlight, people will doubt your sanity. If you doubt their existence under the moonlight, however, you might find yourself on a slab in the morgue. Some people say that these are the kinds of beasts who feed off of your fear, and so that explains why they don't physically attack humans. The real truth is that they do enjoy an appetizer of fear before they have their main course, but that main course is meat, served very rare. If they don't take you down for food, then there must be plentiful, easier to catch game or other food sources in that vicinity. If you go out in the wilderness thinking any animal out there, whether normal or supernatural, is only out to spook you and is going to be satisfied with that, then I think you're anthropomorphizing these beasts. If I used that word correctly, then I'm saying you're projecting a human way of thinking onto a very wild and savage life form. That last statement applies to both the werewolves and the dogmen, although I suppose this is as good a place as any to point out the difference in meaning between the two. Dogmen are animals the size of bears, or sometimes even larger. They have canine heads, but are as adept at walking or running upright as they are in doing so on all fours. As a result, they are sometimes seen as oversized wolves or dogs, while other times can be seen as one or more werewolves or wolfmen, walking on their hind legs just as men do. Werewolves and dogmen can sometimes look identical, at least from a distance. Werewolves are not really animals, though. Werewolves are human beings who transform into creatures that look very much like dogmen, but which are actually not. Some werewolves transform because of a curse, some others because of an affliction, and a third kind transform deliberately and willingly. That third class of werewolves go by various names in various cultures, such as skinwalkers or wizards or wise men or brujos. As I have never been close with any of those people, I do not know what their overall aims and goals might be. I don't know if they are evil, as some people tell me, or if they are good, as others say. Possibly I would not even understand their goals if they told me. Possibly they are something beyond good or evil. Possibly we ourselves just don't know enough to judge them. I was told by a personal confidant that dogmen have either white or amber-colored eyeshine, but the werewolves could often give off a far redder and more sinister glow from their eye sockets. I asked how they could tell the difference, and they told me that the ones with red eyes sometimes are also seen wearing scraps of clothing. His reasoning was that these must be werewolves. These must be people who transformed from being human into that form. You would never see a dogman wearing clothing. A dogman is a kind of a savage, feral dog. It's not really a human in any way. A dogman never changes its shape or transforms, as a werewolf does. There are different factions who argue about whether dogmen are natural animals like bears or cougars, or whether they are paranormal in some way. Is this due to people confusing dogmen with werewolves? Or is there something out of the ordinary about both kinds of beings? I've heard a man who does not even believe in werewolves tell me that he is certain dogmen come from another kind of reality and possess powers which to humans would seem magical. Since these aren't the types of critters you can trap and study, tag and release, there's naturally going to be a lot of guesswork involved concerning their behaviors. The werewolves are literally human, and among the smartest of humans, while the dogmen are physically far quicker and stronger than we are, while possessing a kind of intelligence far wiser and sharper than your typical canine. If you encounter either, try to stay out of its way. Pray that it doesn't notice you, but if it does, do not run away, and do not make eye contact. If your behavior does not offend it, the beast man may pass you by and allow you to live. If you act scared, though, you will be telling the dogman or werewolf that you view yourself as prey. You will be basically inviting that creature to either stalk you or take you down, depending on its mood. Never leave your survival in the hands of the dogman. So my one friend I met online who knew a lot about the current war going on between the dogmen and the werewolves is this fellow that we can call George. According to George, the wizards who become werewolves for their own arcane reasons seem to have taken it upon themselves to eliminate the dogman population, at least in the middle of our country. Another interpretation is that the dogman instigated the war, but George seemed to think it was the wolfmen themselves who began the current and ongoing series of conflicts. He could only guess as to their motives. He was honest about not understanding that part of it, but he felt that they had instigated what we're all now living through. Nobody that I know can credibly explain to me the actual reasons that these two powerful groups are going at it in the way they are, or what the real stakes are if one side wins or the other. I had seen a dogman one time, and so I wanted to see what George was telling me was happening up in his part of Michigan. He told me he could take me back to where he had his sighting, which was actually inside Deadstream Swamp. First, I'd like to tell you about my own sighting, so you'll know where my head was at when I went with George on an expedition inside Deadstream Swamp, where I did see evidence of the species warfare that he describes. Alright, the year was 2021, and I was driving in the snow up Route 42 around Lake City, Michigan. Snow was sticking to the ground and the trees, and I was happy about it, because it was the first snow of the season. I'm sort of like that. I don't even mind having to shovel the snow. I'm still like a kid about it. So, I was driving a little more slowly than usual to avoid slipping and sliding. I don't remember there being any traffic at all. It was dark out, but I don't remember if that was because of the heavy cloud cover, or if it was nighttime, or both. I just knew that I was alone on that road, and it felt like my own personal snow globe. And then, a big, dark, hairy figure flew out of the woods, silhouetted against the white background. It looked like a big, hairy, naked man running across that road, only I noticed its dog-like feet, and I noticed its wolf-like head, and I felt completely stunned. I hit the brakes, but the dog-headed man was already long gone into the trees. I hadn't stopped the car, just sort of slowed it down significantly. I was probably driving 10 or 20 miles an hour down that road. My jaw dropped down onto my chest, and sweat pouring off every inch of me. My mind was shattered into a million pieces. So when some car came up behind me and beeped at me to hit the gas or get out of the way, I screamed like an old lady. It was not a proud moment. So that was nothing compared to the kinds of stories George was telling me about these skirmishes that supposedly are happening up in that swamp. He claimed one time he saw a dogman swimming from a distance. He said they sometimes swim along right on the surface, or just under it, sort of like alligators do. So he was watching this dogman, hiding, hoping it went by without seeing or smelling him. Then, suddenly, when the creature reached a certain spot in the water, 5 different werewolves flew up out of that water. Some of them wearing bathing suits, he said. They flew up and tried to surround the dogman, who seemed to have quicker instincts than the werewolves. After all, the wolfmen were part-time animals, but it was the dogman's full-time job. So then George watched as the 5 of them swam off after the dogman, and George got out of that area as quickly as he could. So George's stories are fantastic, and I was extremely eager to get to see some of this same kind of magic happen in front of my eyes. We agreed to take an expedition into the Deadstream Swamp together, along with a couple of big, beefy, well-armed friends of his. When the day came for our meetup, I noticed that I seemed to be the most stoked about what we had planned ahead. George and his 2 buddies seemed willing to go through with it, but hardly seemed anxious about it at all. I asked him directly, and the guy admitted to me that he was kind of scared of the idea of going back there in that swamp. It was his idea for us to meet up, but he had to really press hard to get his 2 buddies to agree to come along. It seemed they had both talked him into being scared of the swamp too, or at least of the 2 strange tribes warring inside there. I felt terrible about all this, and asked if we could go at least in search of some proof of these stories, rather than trying to get in the middle of a battle or skirmish. If we could go looking for footprints or something, I said I'd be happy with just that. It didn't seem to make the men seem any more excited, but it made me feel a little less guilty. On the other hand, I was wondering if George had changed his mind because he had made the entire story up. Maybe he was acting like he didn't want to go because he didn't want me to find out he wasn't telling the truth. So there was a wooden walkway, sort of a wooden sidewalk, that someone had built over this part of the swamp that we were walking over. Already I was getting the creeps, and I really wished I had let the guys talk me out of doing this. So we were walking along, our boots hitting on the wooden boards, making the only real sound. Everything sort of quiet, and everyone kind of tense. This was a part of the swamp with a lot of trees in it. We weren't walking over water so much as we were walking over quicksand, really. Just very, very loose, wet dirt that we'd sink down into quickly and drown if we slipped off that sidewalk. When I was thinking how much deeper we were planning to go into the swamp that afternoon, I worried more about the idea of having to make the same trek backward on the way out. Then there was this moment, this remarkably definitive moment of my life. A big brown mass of fur and muscle ran out of the tree cover, and I thought he was heading for me and my friends. We each screamed and ran in different directions. I wound up standing in a 2-foot puddle behind a tree, holding onto the trunk for dear life and peeking out at the scene I had just fled. While I was running away in abject terror, the brown muscular beast had been knocked back down onto that wooden platform sidewalk by a second beast. Now I could see them both, and to my eyes, these were 2 dogmen engaged in either a very vigorous form of play, or perhaps this was Mortal Kombat that we were witnessing. The one was brown. I had seen him first, but the one pursuing him, jumping him, and snapping at him was shaped more like a man. His fur was less dense on his chest and belly, and he was more darkly colored. While they wrestled and snapped at each other's throats and soft parts, I could see the differences between them. And yes, the one did have redder eyeshine than the other, just as George had forewarned me. When the golden-eyed, darker one thought he had the brown-furred one defeated on his back, he made a leap, which I think cost him the fight. He wanted to jump on top of the other beast and tear his belly open right in front of us. But the darker dogman caught the other one with his mighty hind legs and judoed him, as they say. He used the other beastman's momentum to fling him backward, hard, into a tree. I believe that darker one was a dogman. I believe the brown one was a werewolf. The werewolf had chased that dogman in front of us, but it was the dogman who chased the werewolf off into the woods. I've seen enough, guys, I said in a tiny, squeaky voice. I thought my reproductive organs had retreated up inside of me, and I was going to have to go through puberty all over again. Anyway, I didn't have to ask twice. We four just turned right around and left that bog at twice the speed we had walked into there. I went in there with grandiose hopes and dreams, but I left there quite satisfied to have eyeballed one small fight in this larger war, and I believe my friend George without question at this point. So his basic thesis is that there are two tribes at war, and that the intent of both sides is to carry out a shadow war. It doesn't seem that either side wants the mainstream human population to find out about any of this. Is it just a sort of a grudge match? Are they natural enemies? What exactly are the two tribes fighting about? And what would be the consequences should one side win or the other? Somehow, I think this battle will be waging on for a while. I've written to a few witnesses I know and asked them to tell you versions of their stories that they wouldn't mind the public hearing. If and when anything else happens to me, I'll send that to you as well. If I collect a bunch of stories from other people, I may throw them together and toss them your way too. I would really like to learn more about all of this, but at this point, I'm genuinely scared of the idea of getting too close to either the dogman or the werewolves ever again. I suppose if I had to decide which was scarier, the dogman or the werewolf people, it would have to be the werewolves. They understand English. They are human, so they can hold human grudges. Both the dogman and the werewolf can follow you home, but only the werewolf can return to human form and spy on you that way. Only the werewolf can befriend you in one form and stalk you in the other. So, I would say that I am more afraid of werewolves than I am of dogmen, and therefore, if I were to choose a side in this ongoing war between the tribes, I think I would have to come down on the side of the dogman. You see, I think Dogman is one of God's children. I think the werewolves are something else entirely. This is why I'm glad I saw that dogman chasing the wolfman off, and not the other way around. So maybe round 1 went to the wolfman, and round 2 went to the dogman. But the big question is, what will humanity win or lose in the battle of the upright walking canids? Don't go anywhere. We've got 3 more Dogman stories to go in this episode, and we call this next one Dogman Overhead. Dear Scary Stories NYC. One summer when I was young, I fell in with a bad crowd. We did what we shouldn't, and rarely did what we should. We were unfriendly to the extreme. We preyed on the weak, and we went places that were off limits to almost everyone else. Everyone else, that is, except the Dogman. They say there is no proof of Dogman. They say he's a mythical creature. Well, I never argue with them, but I disagree often. This is one of those subjects where I disagree with the mainstream perspective. I've seen Dogman a number of times. To be clear, not always the same one. Dogman is not like Superman or Batman. When I use the word, I'm referring to the entire species of Dogman. But I really do feel it makes sense to do so. Deep down, it does feel that every Dogman is the Dogman when encountered by a human. In a mythic or poetic or metaphoric sense, they're all one and the same. But obviously, in a realistic or scientific sense, each of them is a separate biological creature. They're so different from us, and they're enough like each other to make over any appearance of any Dogman into the appearance from the Dogman, at least in a personal mythological sense. Like, when my group encountered the Dogman, none of us would say, "Look, there's a brown Dogman," or look at that huge silver Dogman. What we would say was just the word Dogman, because once again, we were in the mythic presence of the Dogman, him, or itself. I believe the point I'm hoping you derive from this is that there are people who could have proven that Dogman existed years ago. It's just that the kinds of people who are most prone to run into the creature or cryptid are not the kind to go and report what they just saw. They usually see the Dogman when they themselves don't want to be seen, when they themselves are doing something they oughtn't to have been doing. Have I painted a clear enough picture? Because although my friends were not strictly a gang, we were not formed to perform crimes, we certainly played fast and loose with the law, and the way I remember it these days, we were trespassing on private property more often than we weren't. I'm not going to be fancy about it and call my group urban explorers. We just like to be in abandoned places. They may have been decrepit and gross, but they were ours for the taking, and they were free. Imagine having an entire abandoned factory to play in. We once spent a whole weekend at a factory that's since been demolished. I hope the Dogman got out before the wrecking ball knocked it over. Yeah, I said Dogman because there was a Dogman living inside that factory, or at least crashing there. That was my final Dogman experience. That was the one that made me move away from those friends and reboot my life. I should save that story for last. It sort of grew up to that point. In my experience, your best chance of seeing the Dogman is not late in the dark of night, although he's around then too. We saw Dogman 2 different times at dusk, and I saw him just before dawn 3 times, although I only had another witness with me on one of those 3 occasions. My impression is that the Dogman is out hunting, away from human habitation, all through the night, and that he sleeps during the day. Assuming that's true, then your best chance of running into one would be when he's either first setting out to hunt at dusk, or when he's returning home to his shelter around dawn. Why the Dogman should choose abandoned human settlements and buildings to sleep in, away from the nature they hunt in, is an open question. It might just be that their bodily form, being so close to human, requires similar kinds of shelter to what humans need. It could be as simple as that. We build good caves to subsist inside of, and sometimes we leave them alone when we're done with them. We shouldn't be surprised to find other humanoids moving in, at least those of us who accept the possibility of the existence of other kinds of humanoids. One time we were in an old hospital that looked like it had been abandoned in a minute during an emergency. That place was so creepy. There were soiled bed linens still on the beds. It was like all the people inside were evaporated in an instant. There were food dispensers with nasty old snacks still inside them. Someone should have shot an end of the world movie in that place. It looked like a set for a science fiction film. We were opening every door and looking inside, sometimes going inside if we found this room or that interesting. And then I opened one door, and bam! I got the booby prize. In my face was a wolf's growling snout. Allow me to pause and point out that I am 6'3", and I have been since I was 18, so I'm quite unused to seeing growling wolf snouts inches from the end of my own nose. Usually, my face is several feet above growling dog snouts, but then you see, that's a big part of what's so terrifying about the Dogman. He stands up on his hind legs, and he walks around like a man. At least the kind that we would encounter was like that. We were Michigan-centered, but we kept on the move constantly. Half the time I was along for the ride and not even sure where we were. But anyway, I opened the door to that hospital room on that night, and the Dogman was standing on the other side, just waiting for me to do exactly what I did. Once I opened it up, he sort of showed me his teeth. He snarled, and he took one step toward me. That was all that was required to get me to step backward and trip over an old mop bucket, getting ages-old sludge on me as I fell to the floor loudly. The Dogman just stood there in the doorway watching me as I slipped and slid out of there. That was the first Dogman I had seen, but the group had been talking to me about them for some time. They'd always get dead serious when talking about the Dogman, but I kept thinking that they must be joking. Nothing like what they described could exist. And yet, that night, in that hospital, I finally ran into one on my own. I ran back to join the others, and I couldn't even speak in complete sentences. I was that shocked. It was big. It was brown. It looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger had a child with the big bad wolf. It stood up the same as you or me. It had a broad, weightlifter's chest. It had arms as thick as tree trunks. And it had a wolf head over this hairy humanoid body. It was not a human exactly. I mean, the legs were just like a canine's back legs. But wow, that head was the most savage and frightening thing that I'd seen up to that point in my life. It looked feral, and yet it just stood there, observing me, as I desperately crawled away. When I got the word to the others that one of these beastmen was on the premises, we all got the heck out of that place. I forget how many times we were driving from one location in the Midwest to another, and we would see the Dogman racing across the road in front of us. If you're looking for out-of-the-way places at night, then you're sort of a kindred spirit to the Dogman. You see, that's his MO as well, even in the darkness, and even when you only saw them for literally 3 seconds. You could tell that there was some variety to the species. There are black-furred ones, silver-furred ones. The one that I got face-to-face with was brown like a brown bear. I have little doubt they probably come in as many different varieties as four-legged canines do. So although that first hospital encounter with that brown Dogman was maybe the most shocking one, it was the realization that I was just going to keep running into the monster men that made me want to give up and go back to living during the daytime. I sort of got scared straight, not by any one particular shock, but by the piling up of so many unhappy surprises foisted on me and my companions by these various Dogmen. I promised I would tell you what happened at the factory. I could have died that night, and if I hadn't looked up over my head at the exact moment I did, then I really might not have made it out alive. So we were walking around in this place, a multi-story building with a lot of old machines left inside it to rust. I was wondering what they had once manufactured there, looking around, when something, I don't know what, but something, told me to look up. When I did so, I saw a big, gray Dogman looking down at me through a partially broken glass skylight. The exact same moment I looked up and saw him He stepped off the edge and crashed through that skylight, heading down directly toward landing on top of me, along with a rain of glass shards. Well, whatever had told me to look up in that moment saved my life, as I just took off running and avoided the glass as well as the Dogman. I remember all of us screaming. I remember all of us running. I remember regrouping outside, and I remember one of us still being missing when we drove on out of there. I was gone before noon the next day, and I never saw any of those people again. I never found out if that last guy made it out of the factory alive or not. I was done with this lifestyle. I was scared straight by the Dogman. I stopped living at night, and since then, I've lived during the day like most of the rest of you. It seemed every time I was doing something wrong or going someplace I shouldn't, there was the Dogman. I admit, I never really grew up or matured. I just got sick of being chased by the Dogman. I didn't grow into adulthood so much as I was terrified into it. I mean, I don't actually think that Dogman was intentionally trying to teach me lessons like the mighty ISIS on Saturday morning in the 70s. I just think that fate invited the Dogman onto the scene whenever I started doing something I shouldn't have been doing. I'm not exactly saying that Dogman helped me to mature, but I do think I had a guardian angel who kept allowing the Dogman to get up in my face. And the straw that broke the camel's back, the thing that got me back on a healthier path in my life, was the night when I looked up and I saw Dogman Overhead. Good old Zach, he's got our back. Please join me in thanking Zachariah Kittle for making this episode possible. Zach just upgraded his channel membership so that now he can check out our over 25 hours of archived, secret, scary, uncensored Dogman stories, far too wild to ever tell on this channel. We just dropped our 4.5 hour long Volume 5, which goes back to July of last year, with dozens of Dogman stories too violent or too something to be told to you here. We took out the intros and outros so you could just binge story after story. Dogman in America's Heartland. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I keep searching the internet for Dogman stories from the Midwest, because that's where I had my one single cryptid experience. It was a Dogman I saw, but it was not the Michigan Dogman, nor was it the Wisconsin werewolf. I was south of the Great Lakes region, but I was way too far north for what I saw to be labeled a Lougarou, or Rougarou, or Louisiana werewolf. So, what exactly did I encounter? I'll go ahead and tell you as much of the story as I can remember, all these years later, and maybe you can tell me exactly what this creature or entity was. I say creature or entity because although it struck me as being an animal and not a man, there was something about the way it stood upright bipedally and the look on its face behind those blindingly bright eyes that told me it might be a lot more intelligent than I was at first assuming. It certainly never had a dumb look on its face. It looked like it knew more than I did, and it looked like it was thinking 12 steps ahead. It had a very intimidating demeanor, in my opinion, especially back then when I was barely an adult. I was always just living in the moment. Even children could defeat me at chess because I never thought ahead. This Dogman looked like he was thinking ahead, behind, sideways, and upside down. So, this all happened while I was on the job, technically speaking. When I was a very young man, let's say 1983 or 84, I used to run merchandise for my father from our home in Missouri up to one of his clients in Minnesota. It was quite a drive, but I enjoyed it, as it felt like freedom to drive northward through those cornfields. Some times of year you could see for miles as you drove over there, and other times the corn would be growing up so high and so tightly packed together that you couldn't even see a foot or two off the road. I'm pretty sure that this happened on Iowa Route 144 in Perry, Iowa, with corn as far as the eye could see. I guess it was later summer or early fall when the corn was too high for me to see over. There are a number of roads in that part of the country that look like that. Nothing but corn as you drive along. So it's possible I'm naming the wrong road. Either way, it was definitely in that general neighborhood. If I didn't see the creature on Route 144, then I saw it either heading toward or coming from there. It was walking through the fields, and I got in its way. So in the middle of the drive, my father's old truck was not acting right. I pulled off to the side by the corn and opened the hood. This happened as Dad was already financing 2 new trucks, and we'd already planned to scrap this one, so I can't say I was surprised to open the hood and find it overheated. I gave that old grandpa engine some water, and I left the hood open, giving it a chance to cool off, and me too. On days like that, I brought cans of imitation lemonade in a cooler along with me. I had some nice cold Country Time lemonade flavored drink, and both the engine and I let off some steam and cooled ourselves down. Out of all the things I find interesting about Dogman stories, I'm probably most interested in how the Dogman made his appearance and what reaction the witnesses had. It seems most like to talk about how the Dogman brought fear with him, fear that's so tangible, some even wonder if he's able to project it around himself in some way. Others talk about the savagery of the animal, while still others describe what they see as graceful and beautiful. I listen hardest to those parts because I always wonder how much these perceptions come from the Dogman itself and how many come from the predispositions of those witnesses. Like, if I saw one of these Dogmen described as beautiful, would that be an adjective I would use as well? Or would I notice completely different things about that same beast man? Well, in either case, when I first saw Dogman, he was stumbling ungracefully out of the corn and into the road ahead of the truck. By Dogman, I mean a tall man with a wolf's head, a naked man, but covered with so much silvery gray animal fur that he looked more like an upright walking canine than a man at all. The beast man turned to stare at me, and even at that distance, I could see his pupils dilate and begin to reflect eye shine back at me. His long snout pulled back into a grin, revealing his long teeth, as if to let me know that I was now in trouble. I ran into the cab of the small truck, not having time to close the hood. Dogman tried to beat his way through the driver's seat door, so I started the engine and put it in reverse, driving backward. It wasn't really an option to drive forward since I couldn't see forward with the open car hood blocking my view. This is a bit of a sidetrack, but one that might be interesting to other Dogman witnesses like myself. In that instant, I came up with an idea for people who are afraid of winding up in this same situation as me. What if you had rear view mirrors in the back of your car facing front? If I had that on my dad's old truck that night, then I would have been able to see forward, even with the hood open. I would have had to face backward, look in the mirrors facing front, and then I could drive forward. I wish I had acted on this invention idea back then. Nowadays, it feels like soon they're probably going to force us all to use robot drivers. How would a robot driver react to harassment by the Dogman in the cornfields of Iowa? So, I drove backward, and then I did it faster. The Dogman slipped and fell away, then recovered. It banged its arms and hands or paws into the door on my side of the truck, each blow making me feel like he was lifting the truck up off the road a little bit. It was quite disorienting. Twisted around backward, driving in reverse, a canine man thing trying to fist fight with your father's broken down old vehicle. Disorienting was definitely the correct word, and I swear to you that unless somebody had spiked that can of country time, I was completely sober. I was so frightened and so unhappy about the stress this situation was causing that I'm afraid I wished harm on that dogman. I wished that he would slip and fall under the wheel of that vehicle. I admit that to this day, I feel guilt about what happened next, although I did not actually do anything physical to cause it to happen. So the dogman got the bright idea to try to climb up on top of the truck's cab. That in and of itself wasn't so bad an idea. It's just that it decided to climb up in front of the windshield first, grabbing onto the opened but still steaming hot hood in the process. That dogman burned its hand-like paw and screamed an almost human cry of pure agony. Not the type to give up easily, though. The beast tried to land on the hot engine, only to scramble back to the hood and give himself another doggy ouchie. By the end of his fumbling and howling, he, she, or it had pulled my hood most of the way closed and then fallen off to the side of the road. I could now once again see ahead of me, and the entire world clicked into slow motion. Hit the brakes, change gears out of reverse, check out the window to see the dogman already beginning to recover from his burns. The legends of werewolves having the ability to heal more quickly than other life forms had to have been based on something, and I believe I saw what they were based on. The dogman was still down, but he wasn't gonna be for very much longer. The car hood wasn't really locked into place. It jiggled up and down with the wind, but I had forward-facing vision, and I had a momentarily distracted dogman off tending his boo-boo. That gas pedal nearly went through the floor of the ancient truck, which meant the engine puttered and sputtered, and we began to slowly, and I do mean slowly, climb in speed. The truck maxed out at about 60 miles an hour, and that was downhill, so trust me, I was not sure this encounter was actually over. I putted away, watching the dogman in my rearview mirror. For a long time. It was just as well that I couldn't get going very fast, as the truck hood might probably have blown up in my face while I was driving. But eventually the dogman disappeared from view, and I was able to merge onto a busier highway. I screamed out loud, partially in triumph, and partially just to let out my nerves. In that entire situation, I had remained calm, but as soon as it was over, I absolutely lost my mind. I shouted, I cursed, I banged on the steering wheel, and I beeped, loudly. I had a lot of pent-up energy to let out, I guess. Life felt like it had returned to normal, without me having to have paid much of a price at all. I felt like I got away with something, and life has seemed like a gift ever since then. No matter how bad it ever gets, I remember that it all could have ended on that afternoon in the Iowa cornfields, and I'm grateful just to be alive. And that's my true story. Of Dogman in America's Heartland. When it comes to werewolves, check Wisconsin. When it comes to EPs, Ashley Johnson. When it comes to money, ask for Cashley. When it comes to EPs, ask for Ashley. Please join us in welcoming our newest executive producer, Ashley Johnson. In return, Ashley receives multiple perks from us, including being able to check out our brand new 4.5-hour Volume 5 of our secret uncensored Dogman archive, including the other 4 volumes. That's over 24 hours of secret Dogman stories, each of them far too wild to ever run on this channel. We found Dogman sleeping in an abandoned railcar. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Once, a long time ago. I went with my friend who we can call Pat into Pittsburgh to see a band play that we used to be friends with. The show ran late, then we hung out for a while after, so by the time we got on the train heading back to the suburbs where we lived, we fell asleep in our seats. I guess the guys working the train were as tired as we were, because nobody woke us up when we got to the end of the line. Pat roused me when the train was heading out to the yard, apparently being retired for the night. We both panicked and tried to alert someone to our predicament by shouting and banging and trying to move to another car. The doors were locked though, and the window openings too small to leap out of. As panicked as we were, just think how much crazier we might have been going if we knew. We were just minutes away from coming face to face with an authentic, living, North American upright walking canid, or dogman. So when the train finally came to a stopping point, it was the morning. The sun was up, and the next day had started already, but neither of us were home yet. This was the early 90s. We had no cell phones or other ways to let anyone know where we were. And to be honest, I was getting a little freaked out. Pat was the one keeping me calm-ish. He kept reminding me that we were still in civilization. He said this kind of thing probably happened once or twice a month, and he was sure there was a logical way for us to proceed. We just needed to stay calm, and eventually we would get home. It wasn't like we were lost in the desert, so I should just calm down. I knew he was right, but for some reason I was shaking all over. I was stuttering when I spoke. I just had a really bad feeling about all of this. I am not saying I had a feeling we would run into a bear-sized, upright walking wolf creature that would threaten our lives, but I had a bad feeling. We sat there for a while, locked in, and I realized that I would not cope well if I got stuck in prison. We had no way out, and I began to wonder what would happen if the train just sat there for a month. We could slowly starve to death, a 10-minute walk away from food. I was seriously ready to cry when the doors to the train opened, and I screamed in surprise. Pat was laughing at me, I'm telling you. None of this seemed like a big deal to him. He was still enjoying himself. When I think about that now, I think how much we decide ourselves how to react to the world around us. We decide to be happy or upset about things that happen. So when I went to the open door and looked down, we seemed impossibly high up in the air. We weren't at a platform. We were just on a track in a yard. I don't know how many feet we had to jump to get out of there, but to me it looked like we were jumping off the Empire State Building. Of course, Pat just hopped out like it was nothing, then turned around to laugh at me some more. I wasn't taking any of this very well, and it was about to get a lot worse. When I hesitated jumping down out of the train car, Pat mocked me. He asked if he needed to climb back up there and push me out. Finally, I did jump, but hesitantly and stiffly, succeeding in banging up my right ankle, my left wrist, and the left side of my head, all in the same process of jumping the 5 or so feet down. It was a pathetic display, but at least I gave my buddy Pat an excuse to have a good long belly laugh. Laughing is good for you. Limping along with a headache and a banged up wrist is not good for you, but at least I made Pat's day more entertaining. So it was cold out that morning. In fact, it was a lot colder out than it had been the night before when we went into Pittsburgh. We weren't really dressed for the cold, and so we were both highly motivated to get out of that train yard and back under a roof somewhere. The trouble was, we were situated between very long trains, and we were having to walk all the way to the end of a train in order to move left or right. We didn't know what direction we should even be heading in, and we couldn't see any buildings from where we were, trapped in the center of a giant maze of abandoned train cars. It was frightening, that feeling of being lost, but it wasn't as though we knew there was a huge hairy predator literally feet away from us. The wind whipped through those long alleys between the trains, and by this point, Pat was shivering as much as I had been. The weather decided to join in on mocking us. It skipped right past snow, slush, and rain, and chose to drop hail on top of us that was as cold as it was sharp and stinging. When we saw a darkened train car with a half-open door, Pat climbed up and stuck out his hand to pull me up behind him. Soon, we were inside the car, flopped into seats, and catching our breath. This was the same situation we had started in, or worse, because the wind whistled through that car, making it quite chilly inside. But we weren't being hailed on, and so I think I felt less panicked than earlier. I was actually relieved to be where I was. Everything is relative, and it's up to us to decide whether this is a good thing or a bad. That seemed to be what I was supposed to learn from this situation, I guess. Pat was getting too antsy to just sit there for long, and I was beginning to start to want some breakfast. So when he suggested we walk down to the other end of the car and look out the windows, I followed him. Pat was eager to figure out what direction we should be walking in, and I agreed. That did seem to be step one to our getting out of there. He tried the door to the next car and found it was not locked, so we walked the length of the train, peering out the windows to see if we could see anything. But we only saw other trains lined up on either side of us. By the time we reached the last car, we had begun to feel sort of at home where we were. After all, we were the only ones there. The only citizens of our private world. Even though that gnawing, worried pain in the pit of my stomach had not ebbed, I was a lot more familiar and comfortable in my surroundings than I was when the experience began. So when I jogged quickly into the next car, turned casually, intending to drop my knee on the seat to my right to afford myself a better view out the window, I saw that my knee was about to drop onto a limb of a very large, hairy animal, literally the size of an adult bear. I froze my body, knee up, jaw down. I wasn't sure if I was landing on one of its arms or legs, as it was sleeping sort of in a ball, its body and head curled up, with its arms and legs extending toward the aisle. How a beast that large was even able to fit, sleeping or deceased, across those two seats is a good question in and of itself. Well, I saw where my knee was about to drop, and at the time, I thought I was seeing a bear that had died in that spot. Nauseated by the idea of touching something that was no longer alive, I pulled my knee back and lost my balance. This meant I fell over loudly to my left, causing Pat, who was not yet aware of the big bear, to break out into hysterical laughter. Well, first of all, it wasn't a bear. Second of all, it wasn't passed away either. I don't know if it was me crashing to the floor or Pat laughing about me crashing to the floor, but one thing or the other woke that big hairy beast up. And that was when Pat and I found out that we were in the company of an actual Pennsylvania dogman. So this thing sits up, looking like we just woke him up from a dream, like he's groggy, and he's disoriented, and he's grumpy, and he's confused. I'm talking about a really, really big, broad-chested, hair-covered man, but with a monster face on top. Now, I was raised to be polite if someone is, unattractive, but when I caught a side view of that furry man, I screamed in horror. At that point, the hideous dog-faced man stood up, banging his head against the ceiling of the car. I saw Pat take off away from me as the dog-headed man, angry after bumping his noggin, focused all his unhappy attention on yours truly. I crawled away until I could stand and walk and run. There was a half-open train door ahead to my right, and I ran toward it at top speed, entirely forgetting how afraid I had been to jump out that first door that morning. I leaped at the door, envisioning myself flying through, but I ended up banging into the sides and almost falling back into the dogman's waiting arms. I pulled myself through that too tight opening, and I found Pat outside already, ready to help me jump down. We ran away, Pat saying over and over again, "Don't worry, the dogman isn't going to follow us. Don't worry, the dogman isn't going to follow us." He was interrupted by a sound so loud and so grating that it's hard to even describe. When I looked back, I saw that dogman physically pulling that door open, moving steel and rubber that was only meant to be moved when the train's motor was turned on. When the beast leaned out, looking around for us, its upper torso leaning out took up more space than an entire man would performing a similar action. How large could that thing have been? What's the average height of train interiors in the PA transit system? Because this wolfman was taller than that. So I literally stopped running when I saw the size of that beast leaning out of the train car. My legs felt rubbery, and I realized I could never outrun that beast. I was overmatched, and I accepted that the day of my personal doom had arrived. The dog-like monster began to climb out of the train when I heard a shouting behind me, and I watched the dog turn to look in the direction of that shouting. Then I saw that dogman's eyes widening, and he withdrew his body back into the train as if he had been terribly frightened by whatever he saw. If something could scare a man-thing twice my size, then I was already pre-frightened. I felt a great sense of relief at the dogman's withdrawing into the train, but I felt just as great a sense of foreboding about what I was going to see when I turned around and focused on that shouting. And so it was with quite intense fear that I turned around and laid my eyes on a little short, overweight fellow wearing a PA transit uniform. He was just yelling at us that we weren't allowed to be where we were. That was something we already knew. I opened my mouth to tell the small man just that, but something about the realization that our nightmare had finally come to an end caused these strange noises to come out of my mouth instead of speech. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in some room somewhere, having smelling salts wafted under my nose. That stuff is nasty. So, Pat had another chance to laugh at me for being a chicken. He said I fainted like a lady, whatever that was supposed to mean. But you know, I'm glad Pat was the one I went to see that show with. Originally, I was supposed to go with my 5'1" girlfriend, but her family decided at the last minute to go away on a vacation that week. She was a bigger chicken than I was. I think if she and I had fallen asleep in that train instead of me and Pat, it might not have had such a happy ending. I don't mean that to insult the old girl, I mean that as a compliment to Pat, who was the natural hero type back in those days. These days, he's married to a woman who won't even let him write Twitter posts unless she approves them first. It just goes to show, you can't judge a man by the way he acts when he's young. Pat and I have stayed in touch. I mean, we did go through a pretty traumatic experience together. After all, we found Dogman sleeping in an abandoned railcar. We're giving thanks to Betty Eubanks for making this episode possible. Betty gets to see our weekly Sunday uncensored Dogman stories far too wild to run on this channel. And Betty, like all members at the $3 level or above, gain access to our over 24 hours of secret uncensored archive videos. Over a full day of wild uncensored Dogman stories, each of them far too crazy to ever tell on this channel. And now to fill in the deets about how you too can gain all these perks, may I present international TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman. Hank? Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com, and that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.